Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Just getting ready for the Outsiders. First Moondog will be a separate broadcast, and because it's raining and foggy outside, we're doing it in the hut.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not. An out-of-body experience. He glances to the television, and there he is. Thank you, Barry. Time for Outsiders. Today they are Associate Professor Anne Tiernan. She's from Griffith University's School of Government and International Relations. Ian Hankey is with us too, political consultant, a former Howard government advisor. And Sabine Wolfe, researcher. This says at the Institute of Public Affairs. Is that right, Sabine?
That's absolutely not right.
That's very old.
I don't know why that's still on there.
Give us the full title.
I'm actually a Senior Research Executive at JWS Research.
Thank you very much. We've now transcribed that for future appearances.
Excellent.
Now, the big news in recent days, I think, and it's eclipsed much, has been the arrests in Melbourne. Some young men apparently was set on a terrorist event around ANZAC Day. Here's the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews responding to those arrests.
These individuals arrested today are not people of faith. They don't represent any culture. This is not an issue of how you pray or where you were born. This is not about those issues. This is simply evil.
And Tiernan, why can't we get our head around the fact that young men like these may well act out of a sense of their religious commitment? Why can't we say that?
Oh, Jonathan, I don't think we know what is motivating these young men to act at the moment. It's pretty early in the investigation, from what I've read, so I'd be loath to weigh in on it too much. I think there's obviously a lot of the fact that Anzac Day has been named, as a potential target in this matter. I think is very divisive. We had the Reclaim Australia protests the other week. I think leaders are really trying to keep people calm and make sure that some of that bad feeling doesn't break out amongst communities.
What do you make of that, Ian?
I'm afraid I would probably disagree. I think...
Don't be afraid to disagree.
No.
That's all right.
I'll be a bit dyspeptic. No, I tend to disagree, and I think it's fairly clear from previous examples that we've seen of people acting out of some religious conviction, whether or not that's a valid conviction or not. They are acting out of some religious conviction. I think it's pretty clear, and I think it should be acknowledged so it can be dealt with appropriately. Trying to pretend something hasn't got a religious overtone when it has doesn't help anybody dealing with this particular issue.
Twitter seems to be siding with you, Ian. One message there. We've got to stop tiptoeing around religion on eggshells as if it's somehow special and above reproach, says one tweeter. Sabine Wolfe, is the risk in this? Yes, there's the risk that Anne refers to of division, and that's something we need to be conscious of and mindful of. But is there another risk too, that we just misinterpret the thing it is that we're fighting if we don't allow that it has some sort of an element of faith?
Well, we could be like Kevin Andrews and fail to name the thing that we're fighting.
Poor Kevin.
That's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Kevin, if you're listening.
Kevin, the Minister for Defence, who sadly does not appear to have access to Wikipedia, who could otherwise have discovered that.
Yes, but I mean, I think it's quite interesting that it's happening, and I was listening to your previous segment about nationalism and Anzac Day and how, we're getting these overtly nationalistic overtones coming through with the centenary of Anzac Day drawing closer and also with the Reclaim Australia rallies. So I wonder if it's not so much a religious thing, but a response to, this weird nationalistic sentiment that happens to be, for some reason, prevalent in society at the moment. It actually kind of reminds me a bit of the Cronulla riots, disaffected young men latching on to whatever they have, and whether it's religion or nationalism, and using that as the frame by which they express their discontent.
It's an interesting thing that we at this Anzac moment, where we're talking about in 1915, 1914, young men seized by this opportunity for adventure and for sort of the national ideal as well. And yet when that happens now to people with whom we don't necessarily agree, we think it's a weird thing. We should have perhaps a greater capacity to understand these young blokes.
This has been happening eons.
Forever.
I mean, forever. I mean, it's nothing. Let's not get too excited about something that's been happening forever and will continue to happen. But I mean, we've seen this before in Australia anyway, with people going up to join the international brigades in Spain back in the 1930s, you know, fighting for what they believed in. Now, in this case, I believe people are taking some sorts of actions for a particular set of beliefs. Now, whether or not those beliefs are correct or not doesn't, you know.
Yeah, and I think Sabine was spot on in saying disaffected young men latching onto something. I'm not aware I'm aware that there's a connection to, a mosque and some, radical group, but the extent to which that's driven by a religious conviction rather than a sense of exclusion and some of these other appeals, I think the jury's out on that one.
But the whole thing needs to be considered, doesn't it? I mean, out of this sort of sense of perhaps too cautious political correctness is the sort of thing we heard from the Premier. We exclude what's clearly an element.
Look, COAG debated this issue on Friday. I mean, in not that we heard much about it in the sort of the Western Australian GST kind of dust up, but COAG has talked at length about counter radicalisation measures. If people want to go and look at the communique, there's a whole bunch there about working with communities to identify and manage. So this sort of shared responsibility narrative runs through what COAG's got in mind. So I think that would be on the mind of leaders.
And it seems to be. I mean, on the evidence of these arrests, the work is effective. The tabloids, though, Sabine, perhaps you're interested in this, have a particular take on it and are not mincing their words. The Sunday Telegraph and the Sunday Herald Sun today are clearly they have better sources of information than the police. Their report begins thus: an Islamic State terror plot to kill law enforcement officers with knives and swords in Melbourne on ANZAC Day has been thwarted.
How many terrifying things can you fit into the one sentence? Islamic State, swords, ANZAC Day. That's just terrible journalism. I'm sorry.
It's making stuff up.
It's not an Islamic State plot. Like, that's actually completely false. I think The Age maybe described it as an ISIS-style plot, which is slightly more defensible, but to say it's an Islamic State plot is just completely wrong. There's no connection with, Islamic State leadership in this at all.
The other thing in all the headlines, Ian Hankey, is the combination of teen and terror, and these are the two things that tabloids know terrify their readers most: terrorists and teenagers.
Probably, yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, it's nice alliteration of two teens and terrorists. I mean, it sort of has a certain nice alliteration. I sort of like that tabloid sort of television. And
although they drive their own agenda. I mean, this is a moment which is made for ramping the anxiety, which is perhaps unhelpful.
But not uncommon amongst papers. It's always been ever thus. If you can actually beat something up, why the hell not, particularly for a Sunday when you're trying to get your sales up.
10:15 on Sunday Extra, we're listening to our outsiders, who this morning are Anne Tiernan, Ian Hankey and Sabine Wolfe. A moment of tremendous reassurance in the political sphere overnight when a recording emerged of Tony Abbott finally defining his pre-budget narrative. The PM there in his natural habitat.
Can we get confirmation on whether that was actually a beer and not a shandy or whatever?
Well, but Tony Abbott, famously with a women problem, also has a beer problem. That during the most recent campaign, he sculled a pot of shandy. This time it was a schooner of full-strength ale. Clearly, Anne Tiernan channeling the spirit of the great reformer Bob Hawke.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that we're even talking about this morning. I think Prime Ministers need to be able to relax. It's a pretty full-on job. He's had a big few months, Tony Abbott. So I think, having a bit of fun is no bad thing. And I think people who've, dealt with Abbott up close know that he actually is quite funny and good in those social situations. I guess the thing is that it'll reinforce his blokey image. But I was thinking, as, we were talking about this morning, that, it might, in the same way as Kevin Rudd's, is it Scores? I've got Hooters on my mind. Was it Scores? In that way, they kind of boosted him because he was a bit boring before that. Maybe Tony Abbott letting his hair down, it might be a bonus.
I think there's for someone who works in politics, what's really interesting about this, and it's something we teach when we're working with politicians and others, just to be aware that now you're are constantly under scrutiny, and everything you say and do, regardless of where you are, is going to be recorded.
The
Man
audio.
can't scull a beer in the privacy of his own pub anymore.
Well, listen. I'm just saying it's remarkable how intrusive media has now become. And
well,
there
it's
is a
not
new
media. The audio we just heard is an iPhone held
yeah,
by
exactly.
one of the
That's what I
students,
mean.
so
But it is media, and everybody now is a broadcaster. There is a product out with Twitter, and it's not just Twitter. There's a few others called Periscope and Meerkat, where you can do live streaming to your Twitter account. Everybody can now become a narrowcaster.
Yes.
Everybody can be a commentator. There is not one moment of privacy that you have anymore unless it's in the locked doors of your own home. And this is something that everybody, not just politicians, but everybody has to be aware of. It's quite intrusive now.
And we
I
changed.
think that's a great point, Ian, actually, because if anybody's seen the video this morning, it's quite a darkish room,
Yeah.
and there's clearly a light off somebody's mobile phone to kind of facilitate the filming. So
Well, there's
it's-
the Prime Minister's minders who brought a small amount of modest lighting with them.
that's right.
But it's and I mean that is another factor. I mean, you can use these things. You can, use this sort of technology to manipulate an image. I mean, we've seen that with Hillary Clinton.
He actually finished the beer.
Yeah, right.
I mean, we jest, but Sabine, we're sitting here a month out from a budget, and a budget that is going to be, well, a term-changing moment for either the Prime Minister and/or his government. Are we struggling in a transition between what at the time of the last election was a budget emergency sort of deployed for rhetorical purposes, and one that is suddenly real?
Yeah, I don't think that transition has been managed very well at all. So, and it's due to contradictory messaging that we've received over the last 18 months. There is a budget emergency, but there isn't. And, things are all fine, but they're also not. And so it's been really difficult for the public to get a handle on what has actually been happening with the budget. Now, if we are in a situation where there is a budget emergency, it's going to take political will, political capital, and a not inconsiderable degree of hardcore political communication to actually convince the public that maybe spending cuts or tax reform is actually needed. But I don't see that this government has any of those things.
And yet, Antina, there seems to be a conversation running almost outside of the political framework, more broadly around the budget, around tax, around the issues that we confront. Does that conversation give the government a bit of license to act tough, perhaps tougher than the conventional wisdom might suggest they could?
Look, I think Sabine's spot on in saying the agenda management and the economic narrative kind of reform is awful, and the business community is very frustrated, as we've seen. I think, in a funny way, the debate with Western Australia last week over GST, the fact that the revenue situation is so awful, might actually give the Prime Minister an opportunity through the Leaders' Summit in July to focus on the two things that they initiated, frankly, which are the White Paper on Federal Reform and the White Paper on Tax Reform. I mean, they had this process, but then they gave it no attention. Now that July meeting will hopefully be focus the attention and give an opportunity for some of the debate that you're quite right, Jonathan, has run away, and everybody's having it outside of government because they've got no confidence that government can manage the process.
But Anne, I actually think that the fact that this debate is now happening outside the confines of government is a good thing, and in a way, deliberately or not, the government has actually pushed off. Businesses rightly saying they're very concerned about the direction of things are going in. We've got community groups talking about it. This is the sort of conversation or narrative or discussions that you always have to have so that a government can act. Now, has the government shown adequate leadership in this? I don't personally believe so. But you're right about that July meeting. I think there's a perfect opportunity to start shaping some of these things that are going to occur out of the Federation paper and the taxation paper and so on.
But you're right too, that it gives them the opportunity to act.
Yes.
And the budget is a good chance for that.
When I hate to hark back, but when we're in government previously.
Okay, sorry about that. We're approaching the upload limit. Next movie about to start.